Hi again. So this is office hours. So in this cohort of data engineering, our data engineering course, we don't have regular office hours because for most of the classes we already had them previously in the previous iterations. So you can just go and check them out. But there is new content. We try to keep the course up to date. We try to add new things here. And one of the new things that we have in this edition of the course is Kestra that we use for workflow orchestration. That's why here today we are going to talk. We're going to have this office hour session, live session, where we are going to answer your questions about workflow orchestration. And Will, who is the instructor for the module on workflow orchestration, will tell us a few things. So first, we want to go over frequently asked questions, frequently appearing problems, and that some of you might have already had or solved, but we want to go over them. And after that, we will answer your questions. So the link for the questions, for asking questions, is in the live chat. It's pinned, so go there, click on that, ask your questions. But we will start with Will saying a few words. So hi, Will. Thanks for being here. And before you start, to make sure I don't forget, I just want to thank you for your support. First, for recording the course, for recording the module, and also helping in Slack. And I know it's your work because you're also a developer advocate at Kestra, but I saw that sometimes you answer outside of working hours. So big thank you. Thanks for doing that. I know it's a lot of is happening in our Slack. So sometimes I'm afraid of opening it because there are so many new things. And when I do, I already see your your user picture, your picture under many threads. So thanks a lot for doing that. And with that, I'm shutting up and give the floor to you.
Well, thank you very much. No, I love helping people, and it's been really good to get a lot of feedback from all of you as well on how you're using the product. It's really interesting to see all the different ways you're trying to use it. Good feedback for us on a few things to change. So yeah, really thankful for everyone poking and prodding and breaking the product because yeah, it will only help us make it even better. But yeah, hi, my name's Will. Hopefully you know who I am because you've watched the videos. I'm going to hopefully go through some of the frequently asked questions that we've had in Slack. Just go through a few of them to hopefully help you get to the homework task. I guess the first thing I want to say is for the homework task, I've seen a few of you try and kind of go a little bit away from what I covered in the videos. And while I encourage that, and that's absolutely fine, if you're struggling to get to the end task, the end goal of what the homework questions are, I'd recommend maybe going back to the original examples, trying to get those working first of all. Once you've finished the homework, then you can start maybe tweaking the workflow. I know some of you are trying to be making it running concurrently, for example, but you've had issues and then you can't do the homework. So I'd maybe take a step back, do it the way I did it in the video. Once you've figured that all out, hopefully that will make it all make a little bit more sense of what's going on. But then you can start, you'll have a better idea of how you can best modify those workflows to maybe run concurrently. Or there was a few other people who ran things in Python, for example, or used the Parquet files. So yeah, that's just the first thing. Second thing, I'm just going to screen share. Let me. Cool. So hopefully you should be able to see Kestra. Now, a few people have had issues setting up Kestra. Specifically, getting Kestra running is fine, but the issue they've had is they've struggled with connecting Kestra to their Postgres database. Now, where this all sort of came from is we built this course on Mac, which means that it typically works on Linux too, but a lot of people who've been watching the videos have actually been on Windows. And Kestra support on Windows is up and coming, but definitely not perfect. So hopefully the new Docker Compose, which is in the FAQ video, should help you. Now, it's not actually a file. I'll look at adding that soon. But if you go to the bottom of the README file, you'll find that there is, in the troubleshooting tips, some guidance on how to overcome having like connection refused with the database. And we actually have a Docker Compose file here that has all four things that you need, which is Kestra itself, the database that Kestra is going to use, PG admin as well as the database for the homework exercises. So this should work all together. It shouldn't have any issues with things using the same ports. You should be able to make sure that things can talk to each other because the main challenge is by putting things in containers, the nature of that is you want to keep things isolated, but then sometimes you don't want them to be too isolated and then you can't talk to other services. So hopefully this means that all of these things should be able to talk to each other, which is what we're trying to achieve. But they won't be able to talk to necessarily other things outside of this Docker Compose file unless we configure it otherwise. So I'd recommend trying and copying and pasting this and running this. You might have to then copy and paste your flows into this version of Kestra, but this should hopefully work for you for the homework exercises. Um, Now, I haven't tried this with DBT yet, and for the DBT questions, this is a completely optional part of the course. The reason we introduced it was mostly to show you that Kestra can do more than just simple Postgres queries. We don't really cover what's going on. We just use this content that's going to be in module 4 and just run it in Kestra. So if you're having issues running it with Postgres, I'd recommend just try running it with BigQuery because you shouldn't hopefully run into any connection issues. It's going to achieve the exact same things. It's just one's doing it with the data in our Postgres database and one's doing it with the data in Google Cloud. But if you want to just see Kestra use DBT, all you have to do is just copy and paste that flow. If you've already had Google Cloud working successfully, then you should only have to press run and you'll see it in action. And then module 4 later on will cover in much more detail on what's actually happening in DBT, and specifically the project we're using. Because if we actually go to that workflow quickly, you'll see that we are I'll do the Postgres one, for example. We're literally just pulling the data from this repository from module 4. So you'll sort of, some of it will seem familiar and you can maybe come back at module 4 and see if you can implement what you've done in module 4 in Kestra. Kind of a good way to learn how Kestra is great for being able to incorporate all these different plugins and tools into one place. So hopefully that's going to help a lot of you get started. The last thing I'll mention for frequently asked questions is a lot of the questions I'm seeing are people who have skipped the videos. Maybe they've watched some of the video, not all. And I'm going to call you all out here. These videos, for example, these first 2 videos have a lot less views than the third one. And a lot of the people having issues in the third one, it's probably because you didn't watch the first 2. So I'd highly recommend making sure you watch the videos in order because the content is covered there. People who've gone back and rewatched it have often found that they've managed to find the solution to their problem. So I'd recommend rewatching it if you're still having some issues. They're quite long videos, so there's probably lots of information that maybe the first time you watched it, you didn't quite digest. I tried my best to try and keep it as compact as possible, but there is only so much you can do. So if you're still not sure, try rewatching it. Try and avoid skipping ahead because there's a lot of moving parts, obviously, with doing pipelines. So make sure that you take your time to go through the content because it will pay off later.
Really interesting that the third video got so much more views.
This
So
is
many
the
more.
one where I actually start doing the Postgres example in the video, but the first 2 explain a lot of the fundamentals. So I guess the first 2 are very more
Theoretical?
yeah, theoretical. And clearly people didn't like theoretical content, so they jumped straight to the practical part.
Interesting.
So yeah, I'd bet. And another thing as well is in the actual GitHub README, there's a bunch of extra resources, which includes videos on installing Kestra, the tutorials on like what the different building blocks are. If you don't watch those and jump straight into the first video on Postgres, there's going to be a lot of words and concepts said that are going to make no sense to you. So I'd recommend going for our short tutorial series, as it will just help give you those building blocks. Otherwise, you'll probably have a lot of questions before you've even started. So definitely spend some time going through those sort of beginner resources before jumping into the project. But yeah, that's sort of hopefully that covers all of the sort of common frequently asked questions. I've just sort of checking the chat to see if anyone's asked any sort of follow-up questions to do with those.
In the chat, what I see from Michael, he says, "Nice work, Will. I loved using Kestra so far."
I'm glad. That is the goal, is that Kestra is supposed to be nice, and assuming that everything connected, it's relatively straightforward. It's got a very intuitive interface. So hopefully it's been quite fun and enjoyable to use compared to maybe some older tools on the market. Cool. Do we
Okay,
want to
so
jump into some of the questions now?
yeah, so maybe what we will do is I'm going to share my screen and we will just go through Slido. Um,
Yes. I can't figure out where. Oh, the Zoom thing's gone all the way on my laptop screen behind me. There you go.
you managed. So now I'm going to share my screen.
Cool. I was like, I
And
don't think I can actually stop sharing. I can't find the button, but
but you did, or was it a joke?
no, I did find it eventually.
Okay. Anyways, like just a reminder, if you want to ask questions, it's best to use the pinned link in the live chat. So if you ask questions in the live chat itself, it might be difficult for us to actually follow it and come back to make sure that we answer it. So best to use the Slido link, and then probably maybe there is already a question, the same question as you wanted to ask, then you just upload this question. And we will start with the most upvoted question. Is why Kestra, and why Kestra compared to other tools such as Duckster or Airflow, or maybe like put any other workflow orchestrator there.
Yeah, so the sort of tagline for Kestra is that it's a unified orchestrator. So for things like Dagster, Airflow, Prefect, for example, they're all built very much around Python, which is great because don't get me wrong, Python is a fantastic tool. I love Python, big fan of it. Um, but it means that for some tasks, and we see this with some of our users, they don't want to use Python because whatever they're doing is better suited in something like Go or better suited in something like Rust. And that's where Kestra can come in because it's language agnostic. Because everything's defined using YAML, it allows you to then have your actual business logic be whatever you want it to be. So whether that's you're doing, and that we actually saw that with the examples in the videos, we don't actually write any code. We're just wanting to make a load of SQL queries, and we can do that directly in Kestra with the tasks. We could also have Kestra run Python and have the Python interact with the database directly, especially if we maybe want to do some transformations as well before we start putting data in the database. But the beauty is you've got the flexibility there to choose how you want to do it. And so if maybe you've got a heavily Python stack, then maybe those other tools would be potentially better suited for what you're doing. But the beauty of Kestra is because we aren't writing the orchestration logic, you could say, in Python, it helps you keep your orchestration logic and your business logic, or the code that you're trying to achieve, right, separate. So it means that you can use Python, you could use some scripts, you can use whatever you want, and you're sort of like less tied in. And then the sort of bit about different languages, some tasks, right, aren't suited for Python. Maybe Python's not quick enough. Maybe some of them want, type safe languages. There's many reasons why people use different programming languages to achieve different things. And because Kestra effectively lets you have tasks, which are just Docker containers, you can kind of set them up however you like. You want to run C inside the Docker container, then go ahead. You want to run Python in the container, then go ahead. And it allows you to then
What about R? So there is a comment. So can we orchestrate with R as well?
Yep, you can definitely orchestrate with R. In fact, I say it's language agnostic. We have a bunch of dedicated plugins that allow you to integrate Kestra a little bit cleaner to that programming language, and R is one of those. So there's an R task type. It already gives you a container with R installed. You can easily install any dependencies, and then you can either write the R in line with Kestra, or you can have a dedicated file that you can maybe pull from Git. So you could have it in your GitHub repository, pull it to the workflow, run it, and you can have that on a schedule, for example, if you want that to run nightly or something.
And inline means that I just write code. So like I selected task type R, then I just write my R code there. I assume that the libraries I need are already installed, or I can separately install them, right? And then let's say
Yeah,
data table, right? And then I just,
exactly. You can
my data
install it
table.
before, but yeah, you're writing it directly in the YAML, which I guess some people might look at and go, why on earth am I going to write a programming language embedded in YAML? Trust me, it's not a good idea if you're trying to write a significant amount of code. But if you're just trying to, if you know that a programming language like R or Python can do the thing you're trying to do really well in just a few lines of code, why make it complicated for yourself and try and do it in something else when you can just quickly do it inline in your workflow? You don't have to then worry about a dedicated file that you need to make sure is accessible by the workflow when you run it. You can just add those 5 lines of whatever, run that query or whatever you need to run, and then have later tasks work with the output generated from that programming language.
And judge it by the stack trace that some of our course participants published in Slack. It's written in Java.
It is written in Java. It's quite, if you've ever used Java before, you'll see the error messages and you'll be like, this seems familiar.
Yeah. Do you know why Java though?
Yeah, a lot of people think Java is quite an outdated tool. It's something that only old enterprises use, and it's kind of, why would you want to build a
It
tool?
has this fame, yeah.
Yeah, Kestra obviously is only like, I think it's going to be 3 years old pretty soon. And so you're thinking, why do they pick Java? There's a reason that enterprises use Java. It's because it's a very sophisticated language. It's very reliable. It's quite quick, relatively speaking. You can obviously write some really slow Java, don't get me wrong. But it's quite a reliable tool. It's quite flexible. So that's why Java was picked rather than something more modern. It's quite well established as well, whereas a lot of these new languages end up sometimes they can be quite good. People, I'm going to think of JavaScript frameworks, right? There's a new JavaScript framework every week, if it feels like, and people are very quick to move their entire front end to that framework. But the framework maybe then like dies off or doesn't have much support, and now you're left with I have to rewrite my whole front end because I'm using like a outdated framework that's got security vulnerabilities when I should have just stayed with using something like React rather than chasing the next trend. And that's sort of where the thinking for Kestra came from was it's something reliable. It's something that's can be quite fast if written correctly. And there's a lot of flexibility to it as well.
Yeah, and I was a Java developer before switching to data science. So like when I see these Java stack traces, it gives me PTSD immediately. Don't post
Yes.
too many.
I mean, I definitely get PTSD when I'm editing some of the plugin built-in docs and they're just doc strings, and I'm like, oh, I'm glad I'm not the one writing Java. I get to do fun things like writing Python, but our developers love Java, so if it keeps them happy.
Yeah. Then the next question from Pro100V is this question is more specific about Kestra versus Airflow. Like, what are the pros and cons? We talked about Kestra versus like other all orchestrators, specifically those who are Python based, like Prefect. But I think Airflow is also like Python based. You write Python code. But if we forget about all other
Mm.
workflow orchestration frameworks and just focus on Airflow? So why should I go with Kestra?
Yeah, so Kestra and Airflow, they're getting similar every day because Airflow 3 is going to start incorporating some YAML. So, go figure. Maybe YAML is the new trendy thing. But the
Where
thing
did
that make
they get this idea from?
I know it feels like we're trendsetters here. We're not going to take credit, but it definitely feels like we should. Um, yeah, the pros and cons of using Kestra versus Airflow. Now, especially because you've asked about enterprise, for example, Airflow is obviously a massive tool. Lots of resources online. It's been around a long time. If you want to find out anything about Airflow, it's probably online. But the common thing I hear about people using Airflow, I know a lot of you've had frustrations getting Kestra set up. But once these tools are set up,
Another
uh,
PTSD now you're going to give me.
yeah,
Because I remember in the first edition of Data Engineering Zoomcamp, we used Airflow. And right now, the most difficult week is week module 1.
Mhm.
But it was module 2 back then, the most difficult one. Because like of all the problems we had trying to set up Airflow, that was a nightmare.
And I
So
imagine with Airflow, if you Google how do I set it up, there's probably about 300 different ways you can do it, and they don't all quite work the same way.
yeah, like it was not easy, right? Especially like it
Mm,
was resource demanding too.
yeah.
So
Yeah. So the issue with Airflow is that I hear a lot of people who start using Kestra, they used to use Airflow. It did the job. it was very functional, but it was quite frustrating to actually get it to work and get it working and develop with it. And something they like about Kestra in comparison is that being able to get their workflow set up is quite straightforward. The editor in the platform does a lot of the heavy lifting for you with its autocomplete. Generally makes it a lot easier. So it's sort of Kestra has taken what Airflow does well and gone, let's make a user experience around this. So that's where the kind of one of the selling points of Kestra is the fact that it has such an intuitive interface where you can easily view all the plugin docs built in. You can easily autocomplete that. You can do everything no code if you want. And that's just things that Airflow doesn't have as an option necessarily, especially like the no code. So that's something, maybe it'll have no code in the future with its new YAML interface. Who knows? But the reason for considering upgrading to enterprise. Now, the key way I like to discuss the difference between open source and enterprise is open source is designed as one user in mind. It hasn't got any multi-user support. You can have basic authentication to make sure that no one can just log into your Kestra instance. But if you want to have things like role-based access control, proper secret management, but also like isolation with your namespaces to make sure that certain workflows are completely separate from other ones and having them in sort of isolated areas, then that's where the enterprise edition comes in. And not only do you get those features, you also get the support that comes with it, which is again something Airflow as just an open source tool. Obviously, it's not just an open source tool. It's hosted by Apache, which is obviously massive, but you can't just call up Apache for a bit of enterprise help in the same way that if you're an enterprise customer of Kestra, you get that one-on-one support. And so we've got some people who are using Kestra in very niche ways, or they're using it where they want to have an instance per customer so they can keep everything isolated and make sure they're not, merging customer data together. That's where our enterprise team can kind of help you figure out the best way to get your Kestra instance set up. Obviously, there are managed versions of Airflow out there, but the perk of Kestra is if you have a feature request, we can build that for you. Whereas there's always a limitation, right, to working with a managed Airflow provider because they don't necessarily build on Airflow. Airflow's open source, so they could obviously try and contribute, but there's a few extra steps to get things to get the sort of stuff that you're after. So I guess that helps consider. The cost range is not something I actually know the answer to. So if you are interested and it's something you're considering, you can book a demo on our website. I know that's obviously not helpful if you want to know if you're thinking about using it in a small sense, but coming later this year, we do have a cloud edition coming. So that's another thing that again Airflow doesn't have is you have to host it yourself. We will have a cloud edition that you'll be able to sign up for, and I don't know what the pricing will be on this, but that will be something that could potentially give you some of those enterprise level features without having to be on the enterprise edition.
Yeah, I think it will. So these questions are not related to Kestra per se, but maybe we can quickly cover them and then move on to Kestra ones. And so this question is, what open source projects can we contribute to? And I know Kestra is open source. If people want to contribute to Kestra, how do they go about that?
Yeah, so on our website, we actually have a contributing guide because one of the difficult bits about Kestra is getting Kestra set up so that you can start writing code and then test that it works. Because it's all in Java, it's relatively straightforward to run on any platform. But yeah, so here it tells you how you can build a plugin if you want to contribute a new plugin. You can contribute to the documentation. That's something that I am our new technical writer, AJ, are both very grateful for. So if there feels like there's a guide with maybe something outdated in it, or maybe there's just something that's missing. You want to figure out how to do something, you want to write a guide for it. We more than welcome guides so you could contribute in a documentation sense. Another key way to contribute is you might notice that some of the plugin docs maybe are outdated or maybe don't have enough examples in them. You can actually contribute, if you maybe figure something out, you could contribute one of those. And so, yeah, as you can see here, there's lots of guides on how to run the docs locally. I think there's also guides on how to run Kestra locally as well. So you can get the backend running so that if you want to change things, you can. Now, if you're wondering, Kestra is massive. There's about 200 repositories for every plugin, and there's the Kestra one itself. How do I know where to start? Now, if you go to issues, you can actually filter by good first issues. Yeah, that's the one. We actually encourage first-time contributors quite a lot. And so you'll see under labels, there should be one called Good First Issue.
Good. Here.
Is that going to be? Yeah, here we go. Good first issue. So there's a few very simple things. Maybe it's just a simple little bit of logic or a typo or something. This is something that we are more than happy for you to come and jump in on. So, and to sort of to step back away from Kestra for a second, loads of big projects have this. So I definitely recommend having a look at if they've got the good first issue tag. That's quite a good one. Hacktoberfest, obviously, in October is a good place to contribute to open source. There's a lot of guidance around that. So I definitely recommend checking that out too.
And also, we just had an idea, and today in the general channel, I published a message about that. So we want to build, we want to come up with an open source community project about turning our podcast interviews into PDFs that we can share on social media. So this is going to be all open source. And if you want to contribute some of your skills and work on open source project, that is, you'll be starting from scratch, right? So there is nothing. So it's kind of hackathon way. And then, yeah, please let us know in this general channel under my message.
Very cool.
But also, actually, like many things, everything we do in DataTalksClub is open source, so you can also check our repo and our Git organization, GitHub organizations, like all the projects we have. So for this one, what is the job market for data engineers? Do you have an answer for that?
I don't really. To be honest, you probably know more than I do. What is the job market like? I mean, I know a little bit about the UK market because my partner's a data engineer, so I hear about what she's interacting with. Um, Data engineers are high in demand in the UK, that's for sure, especially at consultancies. A lot of consultancies are wanting data engineers as more and more companies are figuring out this data thing and have got all of this data, but they don't know what to do with it and how to make it useful. And that's where data engineers come in quite handy. So it's definitely a good time to learn to become a data engineer. As to the specific skills and where to look generally, I bet Alexei, you probably have a better idea.
I mean, LinkedIn, where else to look,
Yeah.
or your friends and like network. But also, like in general, from what I see in Germany, that the job market is not as good as like, I don't know, 2 years ago, and it's slowly recovering, but still not anywhere close to what it's been to. It was previously. But if you compare to data science, like actually being a data engineer is more competitive in a sense that it's easier to get a job as a data engineer compared to getting a job as a data scientist. Because like if when it comes to data science, like there is still this requirement of you being quite senior, while for data engineer, yeah, it's like as long as you can program and do data engineering, some data engineering, already have some experience, then it's good. If you don't have data engineering experience, it might be challenging to get your first job as a data engineer, and then you can consider doing something else like backend engineering. And then for that, the job market is quite good, especially if you know Java. Like there are always companies who, these enterprises we talked about, like who desperately need Java developers, and nobody wants to code Java. So maybe this could be your way to get in the industry, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Lots of data engineers on Reddit say they don't need to write any code or little code. How true is this? Because Kestra also positions itself, correct me if I'm wrong, I might be super wrong, but it's like no code or low code solution, right?
Yeah.
So, and then I thought this is an interesting question because like Kestra positions itself as low code solution, and then many data engineers say they need to write less and less code. How true is this? And like, do we need to stop coding and focus on other things?
Yeah, it's interesting because I think while Kestra obviously does shout around no code, low code, um, the beauty is you're probably still going to use something like Python to do a lot of the actual data engineering. Kestra is just there to facilitate it, right? Enable it to happen, whether that's just getting some data from a source, letting Python, for example, transform it and then load it into a database somewhere, as an example. And while we can do it in no code, where you can just drag and drop and just fill in a form and say, run my Python file without having to actually write YAML, um, that part's no code, but the Python isn't going to write itself. So I think it depends. Some companies will be very keen on doing everything kind of manually. I know my partner, for example, she's gone through phases of changing between projects at the consultancy where some projects are not very hands-on, whereas other projects, she's, writing some of the most complex Python ever, but other projects, there's not much. So very much, my answer is it depends. Uh, if you're someone who prefers to do a lot more sort of nitty-gritty technical stuff, then there's definitely roles out there. But there's definitely a lot more like UI-based tools that let you drag and drop, like being able to do transformations and stuff rather than having to write it all in Python. Are they necessarily the future? Well, every UI tool has a limitation to some degree. Anything that's not necessarily code, you'll hit a roadblock at some point. So it depends, I guess.
But also, like now you were talking about that your partner being a data engineer, and I remember my Java days. Actually, back then, there were also many drag and drop tools like Informatica or Microsoft Integration Service. There, would you
Mm.
just, have boxes and connect them with arrows saying what these boxes should do, right? And then you would write no code or very little code. And then, like in this Microsoft Integration Service, it would be like C# or whatever.
Mm.
Mm. And in some projects, it was okay. Like you just want to get started quickly. But like in other projects, you would just go full on Java without like any GUI at all. Right. So, and I guess, yeah, it's still the case, right? Things don't really change.
Yeah.
Um, I suggest we skip this two for now and focus more on things related to Kestra and workflow orchestration. So this one, dynamically generated DAX in Airflow. So when you generate scripts generated from a template outside and load it into Airflow, or using a DAC to generate them. I don't know if you know what this question is asking. I think it's like there is a tool that generates DACs and then puts them to Airflow, and then Airflow actually executes them. I think this is what we did in my previous company. There was a next, like a separate tool that would generate DACs. And how about Kestra? Like, is there anything like that in Kestra?
So I sort of know where this question's coming from. You can have, let's say that you have workflows generated outside of Kestra, for example. I'm going to use workflow instead of DAG here. You can easily load those into Kestra using our API. So you could set up some workflow process, right, where things are dynamically generated outside of Kestra based on the needs of what you're trying to achieve. You can then load those into Kestra, but you could also have it Kestra itself, for example, have a workflow that is generating new workflows, and you can use the API to then add those as an actual workflow in Kestra. Because Kestra is built with an API first mindset, it makes it quite easy to just, I guess, recursively sort of creating workflows and have workflows create themselves and so on. So, and you can also make workflows pretty dynamic. We've seen that with the example workflows in the course, where some of those workflows are some of those workflows, for example, have a lot of dynamic variables where we have to render them because they've got there's a bunch of layers of those expressions, and we got to render each one to be able to get it. So it means you can have a very what's the word I'm looking for? Dynamic and flexible workflow. So you could use that sort of methodology, right, to then dynamically generate more workflows using the API.
Yeah, thank you. So Kestra deployment to production, question from Ignas. Like how do you actually do this? You have one Kestra Docker instance with dev plus prod namespaces, or two separate Kestra Docker instances, potentially on separate VMs. Like, would you even use Docker in this case? You would probably use some container orchestration tool, right? When you want to deploy
Yeah.
Kestra.
A lot of people who use Kestra in production, I'm thinking our enterprise customers specifically, they use primarily things like Kubernetes with Helm charts, right, to deploy them. Now, you're asking of like, what should the setup look like? Now, the way we sort of we envision how people will use this is the namespaces is really just for organizing different projects, things that you're happy to be on the same database. Now, if you're working with things that are, let's say you've got a data team or maybe a DevOps team using Kestra, and they've got different workflows executing different scripts, the data team might be working with incredibly sensitive data that you do not want any other workflows getting their hands on. And so namespaces do not isolate that. They're simply just a folder structure. So if you're working with something very sensitive, then having separate instances is definitely recommended. And on our enterprise edition, we have tenants, which effectively allow you to have one instance, but with isolated components inside of them, if you're not familiar. So you can generate that without having to manage multiple instances. But some customers prefer to have dedicated instances completely separate. It means they can have downtime for one and not for the other, for example. Now, for the dev to prod example, I typically recommend that you would have an instance deployed in the cloud using Kubernetes, for example. But I've also got a video on how you can deploy with Docker, for example, and you can integrate Kestra into like Cloud SQL and Google Storage. Google Cloud Storage for being able to store your local files and your database. So you can really integrate it into Google Cloud. And then locally, you'll just run Kestra, just like we've been for this course, just using some simple Docker Compose. So you can then run everything locally, make sure it all works, and then you can use one of our push flows or push namespace files tasks to be able to then take everything in your dev instance, put it into a Git repository, and then you can have your production instance automatically pull things from your Git repository, maybe using a webhook trigger. So whenever there's an update to GitHub, the trigger will get triggered and automatically pull any new changes, or you can set it up on a schedule to pull nightly so that you make sure that you don't have any new changes incorporating in the middle of like a important session where you want to make sure that no changes get in and cause any issues. It's only when there's some downtime. So that's what I would recommend if you're looking for how do I do dev to prod. I wouldn't necessarily do dev and prod on the same instance. If you're just playing around and you're not doing anything particularly serious, then go for it. Namespaces are there for that very reason, that allow you to separate things. But yeah, I'd recommend having those separate instances. And we've got a whole bunch of information on the docs, which you can see here. We've also got a video.
Is this the right page, right?
Sorry, say that again.
Is this the right page? Because like while you were talking, I was trying to do some Google to find what's the right page in the documentation that describes like all the things you said.
This sort of gives a summary of the dev to prod. The installation guide then has the nitty gritty on using the Helm charts, for example.
Right.
Yeah, I think if you click on specifically Kubernetes, it's
Yes.
yeah, it's
Or
all with Helm chart.
here they say like different Kuberneteses, but then you can also use like plain EC2, then Google Cloud Platform VM.
Exactly, because it's worth noting that Kestra, while Kestra itself is just one single Docker container, every time that you run maybe like a Python task, that's a Docker container. And so that's something where like Kubernetes works nicely because it can manage all the, if you've got loads of these different scripts running and they're all running in containers, you don't have to run them in containers, just to clarify, but we'd recommend it from isolating all those dependencies. Yeah, it allows you to manage all those different containers life cycles just a little bit easier if you're working on a much bigger scale. But if you're just running things, on a small scale, like we are for this course, for example, then just doing things with Docker Compose is more than adequate.
If I don't have a Kubernetes cluster yet, would it be a good idea for me to have one just for Kestra? Let's say I normally run things in, if we talk about AWS, I don't know, ECS or Fargate, or in the Google Cloud platform, it's like Cloud Run or something like that. Yeah, like should I have a Kubernetes cluster just for Kestra, or it's an overkill and I can just try to find a different way of running it?
I personally think if you aren't maybe doing anything super big, I think personally just using Google Compute Engine, plugging it into Cloud SQL and GCS. Same for AWS using EC2, RDS, and S3. I think
Basically,
that's more
these
than that.
guys, right?
Yeah, because then it means your database is separate and that can scale independently. Storage wise, you're just using an S3 bucket. You can have multiple buckets if you want. There's lots of flexibility there. And then obviously your Kestra instance is running and you can control that. I think that that is actually a more than adequate solution. But if you're trying to do things on an enterprise level, then I definitely recommend going down the Kubernetes route.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. So let's see what else we have. Kindly ask you to let everyone know about the potential security issue. But I guess this is a comment about like that some of our course participants can pushed credentials to Git while they shouldn't have done this. And one of the videos demonstrated that you can include credentials in the flow, right? And will you address that, right? So we changed the video, so we shouldn't worry about these potential security issues. So if you're starting the course again right now and you watch this, you shouldn't run into this problem.
Yes.
But maybe we can give a summary for those who actually already watched the video, like, well, what's the problem there?
Yeah. So to clarify, this is a security risk. If this is less of a security risk and more of a user error, you could say, of we had a workflow where can I share my screen to be able to?
Yeah, please.
Cool. Let me.
And of course, like never push credentials to Git.
Yeah, a good practice for anyone learning, and we've all done it, where you've accidentally put a token inside your Python code just because you were just quickly doing something and then you've accidentally committed it. It happens. It's the best way you'll learn not to do it is because you've probably done it by mistake at some point. It's easily resolved, but it's a bit frustrating in the moment. And originally, we had this workflow here that would set up the key value store, which was where we were storing all the data that Google Cloud was going to use, so we could just easily reference it rather than having to copy and paste it multiple places. Now, you don't need to use a workflow to configure the key value store. The key value store can be configured entirely from the UI. So here you can see if I go to key value store, I can easily just add another key value store such as password, right? And I can add in a value, just like environment variables on your local machine. So this is quite an easy way to set this up. But by using a workflow that was just simply designed to be a helper workflow, you now run the risk that if you decide to just put all of those workflows onto GitHub, you are now going to expose the credentials, which is specifically the service account, which if we look at the history, you'll see that we originally had here we had the Google Cloud Service account provider. So this is only a security risk if you committed the GCP key value workflow. Now, some of you have obviously pointed out that this isn't a workflow that you wrote, so there was no need to commit it. This just simply was there to assist you setting up Kestra, but this wasn't really part of your work. And I'd actually suggest that regardless of, there's no point in you actually putting this in your GitHub repository. I'd focus on having those, the GCP taxi and taxi scheduled where you're actually going to be doing ETL pipelines. But let's say you did accidentally commit this. What we've done in the video now is we removed this section. So instead it just says to put it straight into the UI. Another option you can do is what I've done here is I have got a bind mount set up so that the JSON file with the service account on my local machine is simply stored at this location. It's now going to be available in the container at .gcp/credentials.json. And then I've just simply added environment variable here. And Kestra will now automatically let any Google task, whether that's BigQuery, Google Cloud Storage, anything that works with Google Cloud, it will automatically see this environment variable and use the JSON. So this will help you prevent accidentally putting any of your credentials inside of GitHub. But the main takeaway here is if you're putting something on GitHub, make sure you know what you're putting and you're not just willy-nilly pushing everything, because there might be something in there that's maybe somewhat sensitive, maybe something that shouldn't be on GitHub. So do just bear that in mind before pushing everything to GitHub, because you never know, there might be something you might not want to push. And this environment variables suggestion, or using the key value store from the UI, where you can simply just copy and paste the key and then just paste in the JSON content here. That means all your workflows can use the JSON, but the JSON's never visible in them. So when you do commit your workflows, we'll just see it references whatever the key was rather than actually using the raw JSON. Hopefully that, and that's why we set this up rather than pasting that JSON into those main workflows. Hopefully that clears a few things up.
I'm wondering how it works in a team setting. So let's say there is a team and then everyone uses the same credentials, right? Because this is credentials for a particular project. Like when we just have a central server, right, where everyone just uses it, right? So then we don't worry about this because it's already configured.
Mhm.
That's the
Yes.
setup, right?
Yeah, so the key value store is where that comes in handy. On the Enterprise Edition, secrets also are in the UI, so you can configure secrets in your Docker Compose. But let's say you've got a namespace that everyone's going to put their Google Cloud workflows in. You can just have a simple secret set up with Google Service account. The key difference between the secrets and the key value store is secrets are encrypted, so that if the database gets compromised, then it's safe. Because we're not putting these into production, we're just running them on our local machine. The key value store serves the exact same purpose for what we're doing. If we were maybe running this in production, we would maybe want to set this up in a little bit more secure fashion. Yeah, hopefully that clears things up.
There was an article you mentioned that actually describes how to do this. This is what you just described with words, but there's an actual article in the Kestra docs that that tells you how you should go about these things. How should we look it up? Like Kestra?
Yeah, if you go to how-to guides, and I'll again just quickly show
Yeah,
this.
maybe it's
Uh,
better.
Under our how-to guide section, there is a dedicated guide for configuring a Google Service account. Now, under concepts, there is secrets in the key value store. So if you want to know how to do secrets in open source, it tells you that you need to base 64 encode them first, and then you can put them inside of your Kestra Docker Compose with secrets as a prefix. But I always found getting the JSON file, which obviously is not one line by default, could be a little bit fiddly. And often I'd get it put in as a secret, and then Kestra would go, oh, the YAML, the JSON file's not quite in the correct format. So I wrote a dedicated guide to make sure that it's super easy to do. And this is what we want to avoid is pasting it directly into the task, but you can add it in by, again, doing it as a secret using these commands, which will help to make sure that it's in the correct format, or doing at the bottom here, you can use the Google application credentials where you can use a bind mount. And then after using that bind mount, sorry, say that again.
This is what you showed us, like when you shared your VS
Yeah,
Code.
and this is what I just showed you. So you can also do it this way. But personally, I think the key value store method is perfectly fine. It's very quick as well. All you've got to do is just quickly add it in the UI and it's ready to go. And you can now just reference that in your workflow. So I can actually show you if I go to the bottom of this one, for example. I think I removed it because I'm using yeah. So I can easily just add service account in here at the bottom, right? And I can easily just reference that, like so, creds, and just like that. Now I'm able to access the service account, but it's not visible in the workflow.
And actual secrets are stored in Postgres, right? In the Postgres database that Kestra uses.
Yes, I believe so. Yeah.
Oh,
So they won't be. So you won't have any risk of
because
uh,
you're not
the
committing it.
exercises. Yeah, if you're using the exercises, you are maybe copying and pasting things. You're looking at that database. You're not going to accidentally stumble across your secrets and maybe do something that you shouldn't do with them.
And also, GitHub will alert you. If accidentally this happens, GitHub will alert you. That's one thing.
Yep.
Another thing, you just go to, like, if it happened, okay, not the end of the world, you just go to Google or whatever provider you use. Like, maybe you accidentally committed your OpenAI key, right? Or whatever other
We've all
key.
done it.
Yeah. So you just go to this provider. The first thing you do after you discover that, you deactivate the key, and then
Yeah.
you do like usually it's just one click of button.
Yeah. In fact, I had to do this for the video. If you watch the video, I make my service account very clear on the screen. So
Yeah.
after the video, I just made sure to delete that key and regenerate a new one so that I could keep helping with the examples. Yeah, it's okay. Even if it's in the Git history, it doesn't actually matter if the key's been deactivated. So if you delete the key, regenerate a new one, it's good practice to get rid of it from the history. But as long as the key's deactivated, it doesn't mean anything then.
So I see that we don't have a lot of time left, so let's quickly cover a few more questions. So question from Dano. Kestra is a new orchestrator platform that you have introduced. Can I use Airflow instead of Kestra for this course? So in general, while answering your question for using Airflow instead of Kestra, but also in general, like you can use any tool instead of any tool we teach. You can use anything else. So in the modules, we teach you concepts and then illustrate these concepts with tools, but we don't want to restrict you to any particular tool. We do recommend to use Kestra because you will get support from the course team. So if you don't use Kestra, you decide to go with Prefect, Duckster, Airflow, whatever, you will not get support from the course team. So you're on your own. Of course, community might help you, but yeah, we will not be able to help you. That's one thing to keep in mind. But in general, in principle, you can choose whatever tool you want. So we're not restricting you to any particular one. And for your project, just make sure you describe what the tool is. So for example, you decide to go with, I don't know, Luigi. Luigi is an orchestrator I used way back. So let's say you decide to go with Luigi. Just describe there in your README what Luigi is and how to use it. And also maybe mention a few words. Why did you decide to go with this tool? So then your peers who are going to review your projects, they know what this is and how to actually review it. Because here we teach Kestra and everyone in the course is, we assume that you know it because we teach it. So then you don't need to describe it. But if you go off this track and use something else, make sure that you describe in a lot of details what exactly this tool is, how to run it. So then the person who is going to reproduce your project will not have a hard time doing that. Yes. And that's one thing. And then is Kestra easier than Airflow? Well, to me, it looks way easier, especially we talked about setup, but I also think, Will, you gave a very detailed answer to this, right? When we
Yeah.
talked.
I guess the quick summary is obviously that's a very subjective question. Some people might be more familiar with Python than YAML, but Kestra was obviously designed to be easy to use. Anyone can use it, including non-technical people can come in and build basic workflows. So hopefully a lot of you feel that same way, but we're loving your feedback. So do share with us on.
Okay. How does Kestra prevent cyclical dependency loops?
That is a great question because in Kestra we have a thing called a flow trigger, which allows you to have a trigger automatically start based on the conditions of another one. Now, you can imagine where this is going. You could have a flow trigger that then triggers the next flow, and then you get stuck in this loop. That's where conditions come in. We've got a very extensive list of just conditions where you can make sure that your flow trigger only triggers based on you can make it very descript. So that's what I would advise. I'm pretty certain the UI will also say, hey, this is going to cause problems. But yeah, the conditions gives you a lot of fine tuning so you can make sure that you don't get yourself stuck in a loop if you do want two workflows to trigger each other. However, in most scenarios, you probably don't want to do that because you can have a workflow trigger automatically, and then you can have workflows also call other ones. So if you want the workflow to run independently, so you don't have to keep, let's say you've got one workflow that's running a script and then you want it to trigger another workflow, you can have that as a dedicated task called a subflow. But if you want another workflow, for example, like a notification alert to just run regardless if something fails, you don't need to configure that for each workflow, then that's where a flow trigger comes in. So it's unlikely that you'd potentially put maybe two flow triggers in both flows. You maybe have a subflow and a flow trigger, and that's where you get a little bit more control over sort of avoiding some of those loops that you might encounter.
Yeah, thank you. That's an interesting question. What are the top orchestrators in the market? Well, I guess it's subjective what we can mean by top. But what are the top orchestrators, and is Kestra positioned as a top orchestrator?
Yeah. So if you look at the world of orchestration, not just data orchestration, but all of orchestration, there are tons and tons of tools out
It
there.
is
Some of,
also an orchestrator, right? Make
pardon?
files. Make files is also an orchestrator, right?
Yeah. Cron jobs are an orchestrator if you really want to be,
Ah, right,
take things.
right.
If you want to take things down to simple, like it's not a very good orchestrator, but if you want to, run some tasks, you technically it could be an orchestrator, I guess. Orchestrators, there's tons of orchestrators, right? And they all have different things. Some of them are completely no UI. Things like what's the one I'm thinking of? NAN, for example, that's completely UI based. You maybe wouldn't use that for data, but you might use it for orchestrating other things like, scripts and whatnot. And then you've got, things like Airflow, which are very heavy on the data side. What would I say the top ones are in the market? In the data market, obviously Airflow is at the top. Everyone knows of Airflow. Everyone's probably used Airflow at some point in their life. There's a lot of very similar products to Airflow, such as like Dagster and Prefect, which follow the same sort of Python framework, but with a more modern sort of approach to it. So there's that to consider. Kestra sort of comes in as sort of a little bit different, sort of or aiming at sort of infrastructure as well as data. So because of the YAML approach, it's different, but not necessarily worse. Because it uses YAML, it gives you a lot of flexibility. It allows you to, again, like I said earlier, separate your business logic and your orchestration logic. But yeah, Kestra is just where we look closely at the competition to make sure that we are offering the features that people who are using these sort of orchestrators want to see. We're not just, building blindly. And we talk to users. If users are clearly like trying to do something, maybe not necessarily in the data world, but in other worlds, then we want to build a product for them. So, um, Kestra is very present in automotive, retail, for example. I'm trying to think what other ones. Consultancies quite love us. So there's a wide range, and I guess that goes into the unified orchestrator tagline of we're kind of everywhere, and everyone uses us slightly differently. Some people use us to do like Ansible playbooks. Some people use us to do very basic Python. So that is the beauty of the flexibility of Kestra.
I think we kind of covered that already, so I suggest that we
Yeah,
skip it and go to the next one. What is the role of a dynamic variable?
yeah. I'm actually going to share my screen if that's okay, because we
Yeah.
use one in the course. So. In the Postgres taxi, there we can use an expression very simply by just doing something like here, where we want to access our input, which is just a drop down of green or yellow. Pretty self-explanatory. If I want to use that value, I can then use an expression here. Now, why would I want? I can use an expression here, for example. Now, a variable is like an input, but unlike an input where I can change it at execution depending on the value. So it gives me this sort of flexibility. This is going to be set in stone at execution, and it's not going to be able to change once the flow is executing. But what I can do is actually put in a bunch of dynamic properties into the variable. So here, I wanted to get the file name, which if we go to the data course and we have a look at the CSV files, which are here, you'll see they've all got this sort of format of the yellow trip data and then the year and the month. And so we're able to use Kestra to get the taxi color, the year and the month .csv, and we can then use that dynamically. So this gives us a lot of flexibility here. Rather than having to manually type this out, we can then just reference file, which we're going to use multiple times because we use file here. But if I just do a quick vars.file, you can see we actually reference it 5 different times. So it just saves us having to write out that full long, because what we could obviously do to, if we didn't have variables, is we could obviously just write this. This only then has expressions used once rather than having to use render, where it will render, because if it doesn't use render, it will literally just get this as a string, and then it won't be very useful because inputs.taxi isn't very useful to us in its raw format. We want to get green or yellow in there. So while we could obviously copy and paste this in multiple places, this doesn't. We could copy paste this in multiple places. That just has a lot of repetition. It makes things a bit messy. This just cleans things up. Okay, I do agree that the variables do look a bit messy with all the expressions, but then it means down here, it's very self-explanatory what we're doing here. Like, oh, I'm accessing the file name here. Oh, I'm accessing the table, right? Which has got a long name that we want to extract again using various different properties. So that's the purpose of a dynamic variable, is it allows you to basically create these variables that have a bunch of dynamic data in them, so you don't have to keep pasting the raw string with the dynamic data in multiple times. Hopefully that makes a bit of sense. Let me know if you've got any other questions.
Yeah, thank you. And tilde here in the data variable, what is tilde? Why do we use it?
Oh,
This,
here, yeah.
this thing. It's
I don't
like string
actually.
concatenation or what?
I guess it's just doing a bit, yeah, it's just combining the string so that I think someone did work out that you can actually write this by doing vars.file inside of it because it's
Mhm.
technically just trying to reproduce this. I don't know why the tildes are in here.
Mhm.
The key thing about Kestra's expressions are they're very, very powerful, but they're very complex because they're so powerful. And so I often find myself going through the very long the very long reference page, which explains every single like operator you can use to do different things. So um we'll do some more videos soon on expressions so that you can build very complex workflows like this, for example.
And when I need to go through a long page, what I typically do these days is I copy this long page to ChatGPT. I say, hey, like, I will ask you questions based on that page, okay? Paste
Hmm.
it, and then I just chat with this thing, and then it answers. Super handy. So,
Very,
big
very
fan.
nice. Good tip.
Yeah, I think that's all we have time for today. So, Will, thanks a lot for joining us today, for taking your time to answer all these questions in great detail. And again, I want to thank you for creating all these amazing videos and also being around in Slack. So, thanks a lot for doing that. I
No
appreciate it.
problem at all. No problem.
Yeah. And also, we still have one day, right, till
Yeah.
tomorrow's midnight to finish the homework. So, have a lot of fun doing that if you haven't finished yet. If you finished, you can already take a look at module 3. And that's all we have time for today. Do you want to say anything else before we finish?
Yeah, I guess one note on the homework. If you're stuck on the Postgres DBT task, that's not part of the homework. So skip that for now. Move on to using BigQuery. You can come back to that later. So yeah, double check what the homework questions are so you know what you're trying to achieve, and then you can sort of focus on that while time is getting a little tight. But good luck to you all. I think you've got this. I'll be having a look at Slack over the next couple of days. So if you do have any questions, let me know. More than happy to answer. And if I didn't get to your question today, you can ask it in Slack and I'll do my best to have a look at that too.
And maybe last thing before we wrap up. So this video will stay on our YouTube forever, but I know you have work and other things to do. So where can people find you if they have questions about Kestra? You have a Slack community, right? So
We
people should
do.
join it, right?
If you head to kestra.io/Slack, you can join our Slack where I'm active all the time. So if you do have questions or you want to continue using Kestra once the course has ended, you can do that using using our Slack channel. But you can also follow us on social media where you'll keep up to date with new releases. For example, our next release actually comes out today, so some of you will start to see that appear in your Kestra instance. So don't be too alarmed if things look a little bit different before you finish the homeworks. And hopefully there won't be any bugs. But if there are, let me know and we can roll you back to an older version of Kestra by changing the tag to something like 0.20.7, which is what I used for the videos. So if you are finding that things aren't working, you can always make sure you're using the exact same version of the videos, which, as you saw from the videos, works. So that could be a good tip for you too. But yeah, join our Slack community after the course. We'd love to hang out with you and answer any questions you've got.
Yeah. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Will, and see you around in Slack and enjoy the course. Have a lot of fun. Bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone.